Here we are, the Frisian freedom. Is this a period of liberty, fraternity, and equality? Where every Frisian is on equal footing? Well, not really. It was mainly a period for people to fight each other without someone telling them to stop. Before we can talk about the Frisian freedom, we need to discuss what came before. We've briefly touched on the Counts of Holland and the Brunonids in Friesland in the last video, but that was a little inadequate, and admittedly that part was a little bit of an afterthought. So, let's discuss them at length now. The Brunonids are assumed to be descendants of a Count of Braunschweig named Bruno. This would make them an offshoot of the Ottonian dynasty, who were the Holy Roman Emperors from 919 to 1024. The first Brunonid Count of Friesland was Liudolf, but it isn't entirely known how he got this title. The Brunonids would bring four counts depicted here. Next to being counts of Braunschweig, they ruled the three main Frisian regions, Oostergo, Westergo, and Sudergo. They would later expand this to include Iselgo, Hunsingo, and Fivelgo. Egbert I also became Margrave of Meissen. The Brunonids were big on minting coins in Friesland, which is how we know about them. Egbert I was involved in the coup at Keizerswerth in 1062, where he and his co-conspirators kidnapped Emperor Henry IV. When Henry, who was still a kid, tried to jump into the Rhine, it was Egbert and his boys who fished him out of the water. The conspirators managed to hold on to power until Henry came of age. Egbert died 6 years after the coup and was succeeded by his son, also named Egbert. Surprise, surprise, Egbert II and Henry IV did not get along. Egbert rebelled against Henry no less than 4 times. This coincided with the investiture controversy. Egbert lost every time and had to relinquish a piece of his territory after each conflict. First Meissen, then Sudergo and Iselgo to the Bishop of Utrecht, followed by the rest of his Frisian properties. The 4th time that was an up and a downside to his loss. Upside, he didn't lose any of his territories. Downside, he died in battle. His sister Gertrudis succeeded him as Count of Braunschweig and successfully managed to get her husband, Henry the Fat, to become Count of Middle Frisia. He started some regulation of shipping which angered the merchants of Staveren. So they, with Utrechter aid, tried to murder Henry. They invited him to a feast in 1101 and this happened. "Sup party people, I'm here to dine with y'all." They failed however, and he fled on a ship, but the assassins caught up with him, stabbed Henry and threw him overboard, where he subsequently drowned. This murder ended the rule of counts in Friesland. This abrupt end created the opening for the Frisian freedom. But we aren't there yet. Remember this?
And around 1165, they came to a compromise in which they both had the right to the land.
Well, like I said there, in 1165, Freddy, I'm gonna go drown in the river Barbarossa, gave Holland and Utrecht joint custody of Friesland. This meant that they shared various tax revenues and that they together appointed Frisian nobility to the position of sheriffs and judges. Though in practice, this deal only worked when the Bishop of Utrecht was weak, as the Counts of Holland really wanted more influence in Friesland. This culminated in the various Frisian-Hollandic wars. It all began in West Friesland, where William II, who was actually in the process of becoming Holy Roman Emperor, wanted to expand his rule. He took an army into West Friesland in the winter of 1156 to start his conquest. Near the village of Hoogwoud, he tried to cross a frozen lake, but he fell through the ice. In this vulnerable position, a group of West Frisians killed the soon-to-be emperor. They then proceeded to hide his body in a farmhouse. His son Floris V succeeded him at the ripe old age of 1. When he was an adult, however, Floris began the long process of conquering West Friesland in 1172. 10 years later, in 1182, he found his dad's body and buried it in a more respectable grave. After the St. Lucius flood in 1287, the West Frisians were heavily weakened. In 1289, they came to the agreement that Floris was a big boy, and he was allowed to build pretty castles wherever he wanted. And then there was one less independent Friesland. From now on, he called himself Count of Holland and Zeeland and Lord of Frisia. Note that this is not just West Friesland. With this title, he was laying claims for future conquests. But then he got murdered in 1296, due to an unrelated dispute, and that kind of put a pin in the whole taking Friesland business. Not until William III did actions really ramp up again. He tried a more diplomatic approach, however. It really seemed to go in his favor, but when he died in 1337, Westergo took the opportunity to break away during the succession. Only Staveren remained on the Count's side, and not until 1344 did they break away from the Count's camp. But William III's heir, also called William, was no talker, but a fighter. A veteran of fighting in Spain, Lithuania, and even far away in exotic Utrecht, he was determined to conquer Friesland. This culminated in the Battle of Staveren, more commonly known as the Battle of Vins. In the early morning of the 25th of September 1345, William IV set sail from Enkhuizen with hundreds of men. The plan was to take Staveren and build a fort at the nearby St. Odulfus cloister. They would then use this as a base of operations to subjugate the rest of Westergo. To make room for building supplies, the army of knights did not bring any horses. The Hollanders split their forces in two. One half under the leadership of John of Beaumont would land north of Staveren and would move directly on the city. The other half, under the leadership of William himself, would land south at Laaxum. Laaxum was abandoned. William put it to the torch and moved towards Vins. When he got there, he set fire to this town as well, and then moved to join John's forces. However, when he left Vins, the Frisian force appeared. They feigned a retreat, and a part of William's army gave chase. The horseless and heavy armored knights could not catch up. When they were sufficiently drawn away from the rest of the forces, another force of Frisians appeared, and massacred the less mobile Hollandic knights. Thanks to the heavy armor, they were out of their league in the swampy terrain and had to retreat. William retreated to the Reeclif, or the Red Cliff. Here the ground was even marshier, and William and his entire contingent were killed. When this news reached John, he and his troops attempted to retreat. Although he and several hundred managed to survive and reach their ships, many perished during this rout. The Counts of Holland never managed to expand their influence in Friesland again. Except for that one time that Albert of Bavaria conquered Friesland. But that only lasted 2 years, so we don't talk about that. To commemorate this battle, a monument was erected in the 1950s. A large boulder with the following text: Lever als slaaf, or rather dead than be a slave. The Frisian freedom denotes a period from roughly 1101 to 1498. Let's briefly discuss the word freedom in Frisian freedom. The word freedom does not mean the same thing as it does today, where it is synonymous with liberty. Before the Enlightenment, it meant the absence of a king, or in Friesland's case, a count. In this context, it's more like a republican form of government, though it's important to note that a republic does not necessarily mean democracy. It's also important to note that the term Frisian freedom was a contemporary one. It is not a later invention by nationalistic Frisian historians who wanted to glorify their past. Now, it's important to point out that there was no pan-Frisian republic. The power vacuum left by the Brunonids was filled by local power holders. The Frisian lands consisted of small territories that were locally governed. The official leaders in Westerlauwers Friesland were called Grietman. They replaced the old position of Schelta, which was the Frisian equivalent of a sheriff under the Brunonids. In the Frisian territories to the east of the Lauwers, they were called Redgers and Redjevas. These three titles were a sort of precursor to mayors and judges, which you can see in the etymology of these names. These positions were increasingly filled by landowners and local nobility. As you might expect, this led to a few families being in charge. The heads of these Frisian families were called Hadlingen, which is Frisian for chieftains. Feudalism never fully developed in Friesland. The reason for this was the biggest plus of the Frisian freedom. A key component of feudalism was lacking here: serfdom. Unlike in most of Europe, serfdom was not very prominent in Friesland. Although it was not completely absent, being a free man was the norm. A possible reason for this absence is that the Frisian trading economy remained active and that a monetary economy never really went out of fashion here. Frisians had become adept at cattle breeding. By trading in cattle products, they had the money to buy off any duty to their lords. Though there was no pan-Frisian republic, there were gatherings around a hill near Aurich called the Upstalboom, which, by the way, is an interesting place to visit, especially if you can read the German information plaques. The Upstalboom served as a meeting place for all Frisian territories. The first meeting was back in 1156, but this was only for a local dispute between two East Frisian territories. The meetings of more Frisian territories took place in two periods, from 1216 to 1231 and from 1323 to 1327. They met here every Tuesday after Pentecost to agree to laws that would be in effect in every Frisian territory, and to make agreements on how to defend their autonomy from outside powers. You should not, however, see this as a sort of governmental institution. No United States of Friesland grew out of the meetings at the Upstalboom, and it probably wasn't their intention either. It was a meeting to discuss and make agreements between territories. There were several threats against the Frisian freedom. There were of course the outside threats of subjugation, but the biggest threats to the freedom came from within. And these internal problems were mostly baked into the system of the Frisian freedom. In East Frisia, the strongest families tried to take over, and cities such as Groningen threatened to overshadow other territories. But a big downside to the Frisian freedom was noticeable in Friesland and the Ommelanden, the second one being the area that later became the province of Groningen. The freedom caused a stagnation in Frisian society. While resolving problems between families or individuals via violence used to be common throughout Europe, the practice was slowly reined in most areas. But not in Friesland. Here, this feuding system persisted. This eventually led to feuding parties emerging. This slowly created a split within Frisian society, and in the 14th century, two groups emerged, the Schieringers and Vetkepers, or the Greys and Fat Buyers. It's not entirely certain where these odd names come from. Not even the exact cause for this beef is known. One explanation might be that it started out as a feud between two monastic orders, the Cistercians and the Norbertines. This would explain the weird names of these two parties. Skier Monsen was the nickname given to Cistercian monks who wore grey habits. Skier is an old word for grauw, which means greyish, and Monsen is Frisian for monks. Fat buyers might be a reference to the fact that Norbertines were involved in a livestock trade. The origin of these names is only one explanation. It is not entirely clear how all of this started. The feud between these parties, however, coincided with a period of conflicts in the entire Netherlands. Though these conflicts aren't necessarily related, the Dovenschmerz meme is applicable here. Throughout the 14th century there were constant skirmishes and small fights throughout Friesland. The most extreme example was the Great Frisian War, from 1413 to 1422. A war in which many Frisian territories between the Vlie and Weser were involved. The two sides consisted of Schieringers and an allied force backed by the Vetkepers. The direct cause of the war was a dispute in East Frisia between Keno Tom Brok and Hisco Abdena, but the real reason was of course the bitter tensions that were boiling for a long time between the two feuding parties. The families of Tom Brok and Abdena were both looking to become the sole rulers of East Frisia, and in 1413, pirates that worked for the Abdenas attacked one of Tom Brok's allies. The Tom Broks asked the city of Groningen to mediate the dispute, and they chose the Tom Brok side. So the Tom Broks went ahead and conquered Emden, the stronghold of the Abdena family. Their leader, Hisco, fled to Groningen, and when the city refused his entry, the local Schieringers were angered and overthrew the city's council and flipped it over to the Abdena side. However, the allied forces under the leadership of Focko Ukena took back the city in 1415. Ukena would go on to lead the allies to several victories, and the war raged on. Eventually, Emperor Sigismund chose the side of the Schieringers and wanted the fighting to stop. The allies ignored this and continued their campaigns, until Holland came to the Schieringers side and the allies were brought to a crushing defeat at Sloten in 1420. The war ended in 1422, with a peace signed by 94 chieftains in the city of Groningen. The war ended pretty much inconclusively, and the status quo was basically restored. Throughout the High and Late Middle Ages, the city of Groningen had developed itself to be a center of commerce and was starting to dominate its area. In the 15th century, the city had reached the height of her power and wielded influence in pretty much every part of Friesland west of the Eems. Only Francia refused to submit. The absence of a central government allowed the feuds between the Schieringers and Vetkepers to continue, but sadly, one of the biggest problems caused by the Frisian freedom would outlive it by 25 years. The Frisian freedom ended around the year 1500, when Emperor Maximilian I appointed Albert of Saxony as the ruler of Friesland in 1498. But in East Frisia, Edzard Zirksena, also known as Edzard the Great, had consolidated his own rule over East Frisia a year earlier. He acknowledged Albert as his feudal lord, and later did the same thing for his son George. Edzard tried to expand his influence in 1506, when the city of Groningen appointed him as their ruler. It seemed Edzard could become the ruler of a new Frisian realm, but this brought him in conflict with George. George attempted to strengthen his grip on the city of Groningen. Edzard saw this as an opportunity to expand his power and named himself the Protector of Groningen. In response, he was declared an outlaw by the emperor, and the conflict known as the Saxon Feud broke out. This war was fought between 1514 and 1517 and was part of the larger Gelders Wars. It is in this context that Grutte Pier does his thing. But this video is already dragging on. So you know what? I will make a separate video about Grutte Pier and the Saxon feud, and you can take a look-see at that right here. But long story short, the Saxon feud ended in a compromise. Edzard would never become the ruler of New Magna Frisia and lost Groningen, but kept his position in East Frisia and was no longer an outlaw. And in 1515, George had sold his claim to the Frisian territories to the soon-to-be Emperor Charles V of the House of Habsburg. When the Habsburgers took over and restored order, the feuding parties of the Vetkapers and Schieringers ceased to be a force in Friesland. This was also the end of the Frisian freedom, but it had already faded in most areas. West Friesland barely got a chance to join before Holland came crashing in. The city of Groningen had already come to dominate the Ommelanden, and in East Frisia, the Sirkners had risen to become the new counts. But with Albert's appointment, the Frisian freedom had officially met its end. There, we did it! We talked about the Frisian freedom. Join us next time when we'll take a look-see at how Habsburg rule looked in Friesland. And we'll have a peek at the greatest adversary of the Habsburgs, the Reformation. But hey, in the meantime, if this video tickled your fancy, then please support this boy's channel by leaving a like, comment, and pressing the subscribe button and click the bell icon to get notified when the next video is uploaded. And have a good one. See you all next time. Oh, and don't forget to check the Grutte Pier video. Okay, bye.